My grandson Danny had cleaned out my entire life savings account while I slept, leaving me with nothing but a social security check and a broken heart. What he didn't know was that 45 years of managing construction projects had taught me how to build something from nothing and how to tear down what shouldn't be standing. By the time I was finished, he would learn that stealing from Grandpa Frank was the biggest mistake of his young life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through my small kitchen window on Magnolia Street as I sat down with my coffee and opened the bank statement that had arrived in yesterday's mail. At 72 years old, I'd developed the habit of checking every financial document twice, a practice that had served me well during 4 decades of managing construction budgets and worker payrolls. The envelope from First Community Bank carried the familiar blue logo I'd grown accustomed to seeing monthly for the past 15 years. My reading glasses slipped down my nose as I unfolded the single page, expecting to see the usual modest balance that represented my life's work and careful saving. Instead, the numbers seemed to swim before my eyes in a way that had nothing to do with my aging vision. Account balance, $0.00. Transaction history showed a series of withdrawals over the past 3 weeks, each one methodically draining my account until nothing remained. The coffee mug trembled in my weathered hands as I read through each line item. Electronic transfer to Desert Investment Holdings, $47,000. ATM withdrawal in Palm Desert, $5,000 cash. Wire transfer to Luxury Auto Leasing, $18,000. The dates formed a pattern over the past month, systematic and deliberate, like someone had planned each step carefully to avoid triggering immediate attention. My daughter Sarah had been gone for 5 years now, cancer taking her far too young at 43. Before she passed, she'd asked me to look after Danny, her only son and my only grandchild. I'd added him to my account as an emergency contact when he turned 21, thinking it would help him handle my affairs if I ever became unable to manage them myself. The boy had been struggling financially, working odd jobs and living paycheck to paycheck, so I'd helped him out occasionally with small amounts for rent or car repairs. Never anything like this. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls of my modest apartment closing in as the reality settled over me, like morning fog rolling in from the desert. $83,000. Gone. My entire retirement nest egg, built penny by penny through decades of overtime shifts, weekend projects, and careful budgeting. Money I'd planned to use for medical expenses, home repairs, maybe a small gift to Danny when he got married someday. Instead, someone had systematically emptied my account while I trusted them completely. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street where I'd lived for 12 years since retiring. Riverside wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Working-class families, retirees like myself, people who understood the value of a dollar because they'd earned every one of them the hard way. My neighbors knew I'd raised Danny after Sarah died, how proud I was when he graduated high school, how I'd helped him get his first apartment. They'd watched me worry about him during his difficult 20s, always hoping he'd find his direction in life. The phone felt heavier than usual as I dialed First Community Bank's customer service number. Each ring echoed in my small living room, amplifying the growing knot of dread in my stomach. I'd called this number before for routine questions about statements or check holds, but never with my hands shaking like they were now. First Community Bank, this is Jennifer speaking. How can I help you today? Yes, I'm calling about my checking account.
Frank Miller, account ending in 7429. I received a statement showing my balance is 0, but I never made these withdrawals. Of course, Mr. Miller. Let me pull up your account information. The sound of typing filled the brief pause. I see the account you're referring to. There have been several large transactions over the past month. Were these not authorized by you? My throat felt dry. No, I never made any of these withdrawals. The largest one shows $47,000 to something called Desert Investment Holdings. I've never heard of that company. Let me check the transaction details for you. I see that withdrawal was initiated electronically using the authorized user access. That would be Daniel Miller, who was added to the account in 2019 as an emergency contact with full transaction privileges. The words hit me like a physical blow. Danny had used his emergency access to systematically rob me, his own grandfather who'd helped raise him after his mother died. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, supported through his troubled teens and early 20s. He'd looked at my trust and seen nothing but an opportunity to steal everything I'd worked for. "Mr. Miller, are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. "Can you tell me where these transactions originated?" The electronic transfers were initiated online from an IP address in Palm Desert. The ATM withdrawals were made at various locations throughout Riverside County. All transactions used proper authentication and authorization codes. Palm Desert was 45 minutes away, an upscale area where retired professionals and young entrepreneurs lived in gated communities and drove expensive cars. Denny had mentioned getting a new place recently, but I'd assumed he meant another modest apartment like the ones he'd been renting since high school. Apparently, my life savings had funded a significant lifestyle upgrade. "Mr. Miller, are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. "Can you tell me where these transactions originated?" The electronic transfers were initiated online from an IP address in Palm Desert. The ATM withdrawals were made at various locations throughout Riverside County. All transactions used proper authentication and authorization codes. Palm Desert was 45 minutes away, an upscale area where retired professionals and young entrepreneurs lived in gated communities and drove expensive cars. Denny had mentioned getting a new place recently, but I'd assumed he meant another modest apartment like the ones he'd been renting since high school. Apparently, my life savings had funded a significant lifestyle upgrade. "Mr. Miller, are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. "Can you tell me where these transactions originated?" The electronic transfers were initiated online from an IP address in Palm Desert. The ATM withdrawals were made at various locations throughout Riverside County. All transactions used proper authentication and authorization codes.
He might have my money, but I had something more valuable, the knowledge and experience to systematically tear down whatever life he'd built with my stolen savings. Construction taught you two essential skills: how to build something strong from the ground up and how to demolish what needed to come down safely and completely. I walked to my small desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad, the same kind I'd used for project planning throughout my career. At the top of the first page, I wrote Project Recovery and underlined it twice. Below that, I began listing everything I knew about Danny's recent activities: his new address in Palm Desert, his girlfriend Vanessa who'd been influencing his decisions lately, and the various transactions that had drained my account. The investigation would start tomorrow. Tonight, I needed to plan my approach with the same methodical thinking that had made me successful in construction management. Daddy thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime, stealing from an elderly grandfather who'd be too hurt and confused to fight back effectively. He was about to discover that 45 years of building and problem-solving had prepared me for exactly this kind of challenge. The bank statement lay on my coffee table like a blueprint for demolition. By the time I finished this project, Danny would understand that stealing from family carried consequences far more severe than he'd ever imagined. Some structures needed to be torn down completely before you could build something better in their place. The drive to Palm Desert took 47 minutes through increasingly upscale neighborhoods, each mile marker representing another layer of lifestyle I could never afford on my modest pension. My old Ford pickup truck struggled slightly on the desert highway inclines, the engine reminding me of its age just like my joints reminded me of mine each morning. But today, determination overrode physical discomfort as I followed the GPS directions to Danny's new address, the one I'd obtained from the bank's transaction records showing where the electronic transfers had originated.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Desert Palms luxury condominiums sat behind wrought iron gates and professionally landscaped desert vegetation that must have cost more to install than I spent on rent in 2 years. The security guard barely looked up from his smartphone as I mentioned visiting Daniel Miller in Unit 47. Apparently, my weathered appearance and construction-worn hands didn't register as a security threat in this environment of wealthy retirees and young professionals. The building itself rose 4 stories of stucco and glass, each balcony overlooking manicured courtyards with fountains and palm trees. Unit 47 occupied a corner position on the 3rd floor, suggesting premium pricing for the enhanced views. I climbed the exterior stairs slowly, my knees protesting each step while my mind cataloged the obvious expense of everything surrounding me. The monthly rent here likely exceeded my entire Social Security income. Danny answered the door wearing clothes I'd never seen before. Designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a polo shirt with subtle branding that suggested expensive taste, and a watch that caught the afternoon sunlight with the gleam of real gold. His face registered surprise, then what looked like genuine pleasure at seeing me. "Grandpa Frank, what are you doing here? You should have called first. I would have picked you up from the bus station or something." His smile seemed authentic, the same warm expression I'd seen throughout his childhood when I'd arrive with small gifts or offers to take him fishing. I stepped past him into the condo without waiting for an invitation. The interior confirmed my suspicions about the source of his sudden prosperity. Leather furniture that still carried the scent of the showroom, a massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall, kitchen appliances with the brushed steel finish of professional-grade equipment. Through the sliding glass doors, the balcony offered a sweeping view of the desert mountains that real estate agents probably described as priceless. "Nice place you've got here, Danny. Must be expensive." I kept my voice level, observing his reaction to the implied question. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized from his teenage years when he was trying to explain away some minor trouble at school. "Yeah, well, things have been going really well for me lately. Got involved in some investment opportunities that are paying off nicely." Investment opportunities. I pulled the bank statement from my jacket pocket and placed it on his granite kitchen counter. "Want to tell me about Desert Investment Holdings?" The color drained from his face instantly. His eyes darted to the document, then to my face, then around the room as if calculating escape routes. The confident young man who'd greeted me at the door vanished, replaced by someone who looked like he might be sick to his stomach. "Grandpa, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you stole $83,000 from your grandfather's bank account, the same grandfather who helped raise you after your mother died, who co-signed your first apartment lease, who gave you emergency access to his account in case he ever needed help managing his affairs. I was gonna pay it back." The words came out in a rush, desperate and defensive. This investment opportunity came up, and I knew if I could just get in on it, I'd be able to return your money plus interest. You would have ended up making a profit. The rationalization was so complete, so perfectly crafted to transform theft into generosity, that I almost admired its psychological sophistication. Danny had convinced himself that stealing my life savings was actually doing me a favor, that risking my financial security without my knowledge or consent was somehow an act of family loyalty. What investment opportunity requires you to steal from family members, Danny? He paced across the expensive hardwood flooring, gesturing with hands that had never known the calluses of real work. "It's not stealing when it's family, Grandpa. We're supposed to help each other. Mom always said family comes first, remember? She told me you'd always be there for me, no matter what." The invocation of my daughter's memory hit exactly where he intended. Sarah had indeed emphasized family loyalty, but she'd also taught him about honesty, responsibility, and earning what you receive through hard work.
Danny was using her words while betraying everything she'd stood for. Your mother also taught you not to take what doesn't belong to you. But you weren't using that money anyway. His voice gained strength as he warmed to his justification. You live in that tiny apartment, drive that old truck, eat the same simple meals every day. What do you need $80,000 for? I'm young. I have opportunities. I can multiply that money and give you back way more than you had before. The casual dismissal of my lifestyle choices, the assumption that my modest living meant I didn't deserve financial security, revealed how completely Danny had lost sight of basic respect for the person who'd helped raise him. In his mind, my frugality justified his theft. My age made my needs less important than his ambitions. Where's the money now, Danny? He stopped pacing and looked around the expensive condo. It's invested. The returns take time to materialize, but when they do, everyone involved is going to be very wealthy. I need specifics. What company? What kind of investment? Who's managing it? It's complicated, Grandpa. Real estate development deals, multiple properties, sophisticated financial instruments. You wouldn't understand all the technical details. The condescension stung, but it also provided useful information. Danny was either involved in something genuinely complex that he himself didn't understand, or he was being deliberately vague to avoid admitting the money was simply gone. Either way, my $83,000 was not sitting in some legitimate investment account waiting to multiply. Try me.
I managed million-dollar construction budgets for 45 years. I think I can handle technical details. Vanessa, come out here. Danny called toward what appeared to be the bedroom. My grandfather's here and he wants to meet you. She emerged like she was making an entrance at a social event, wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. Everything about her appearance suggested expensive maintenance, from the professionally styled hair to the manicured nails to the jewelry that caught the light with unmistakable quality. Frank, I've heard so much about you. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing social situations. Danny talks about his grandfather constantly. You raised such a wonderful young man. The manipulation was immediate and skilled. She positioned herself as an admirer of my parenting, creating social pressure to reciprocate with approval of her relationship with Danny. But her eyes remained calculating, assessing me as a potential threat or resource. Vanessa, right? Danny mentioned you recently. What do you do for work? I'm involved in several business ventures around Palm Desert, real estate development, investment consulting, helping connect people with opportunities. She moved closer to Danny, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of united support. Actually, I'm the one who introduced Danny to the investment group that's been so successful for him. Investment group. The phrase had a corporate sound that was probably designed to inspire confidence, but my experience with construction subcontractors had taught me to be suspicious of vague business descriptions. Legitimate companies had specific names, clear business models, and transparent operations. What's the name of this investment group? Vanessa and Danny exchanged glances. Desert Investment Holdings, she said smoothly. We work with select clients on exclusive real estate opportunities throughout Southern California. And you needed $83,000 from Danny to participate? Well, the minimum buy-in for our level of investment is substantial, but the returns more than justify the initial commitment. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who delivered this explanation many times before. Danny was smart to recognize this opportunity and act quickly. Smart to steal from his grandfather's life savings. Smart to risk the financial security of the man who'd raised him. The way she praised his theft as business acumen revealed exactly what kind of influence she'd been exerting on my grandson. When do you expect to see these returns? These things take time, Danny interjected. Real estate development isn't like putting money in a savings account. There are permits, construction phases, market timing.
But when it all comes together, everyone involved is going to be very well compensated. The explanation sounded rehearsed, like something he'd been told to say rather than something he actually understood. Danny had always been trusting to a fault, willing to believe the best about people, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Vanessa had clearly identified this vulnerability and exploited it perfectly. I'd like to see some documentation, investment contracts, prospectuses, anything that shows where my money actually went. Another exchange of glances between them. The paperwork is all held by our legal team. Confidentiality agreements, you understand. Very high-level investors require discretion. High-level investors who required discretion about taking money from elderly bank accounts. The more they explained, the more obvious it became that my life savings had disappeared into some kind of sophisticated fraud operation, with Danny serving as either a willing participant or an unwitting accomplice. "Grandpa, you need to trust me on this," Danny said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "I know it looks bad right now, but in 6 months, maybe a year, you're going to thank me for having the courage to make this investment, and you'll never have to worry about money again."
Thank him for stealing my financial security. Thank him for destroying the trust that had taken 28 years to build. Thank him for risking my ability to age with dignity and independence. The complete reversal of victim and perpetrator was so audacious that it left me momentarily speechless. "Danny, I need my money back. All of it. Today." "That's impossible," Vanessa said quickly. "The investment is locked in. There are penalties for early withdrawal, legal complications. Frank, surely you can wait a little longer for much better returns." "I don't want returns. I want my money back, in my account, where it belongs." "We can't do that," Danny said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of finality rather than negotiation. "The money's committed. It's not sitting in some account somewhere that I can just transfer back." There it was, the admission that my life savings was gone, transformed into whatever scheme Vanessa had convinced him to join. Danny had gambled everything I'd worked for on promises from someone he'd known for what couldn't have been more than a few months. I folded the bank statement and put it back in my pocket. "Then we have a serious problem." "Grandpa, you're overreacting. This is going to work out better than you can imagine." "For who, Danny? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my life savings bought you an expensive condo and your girlfriend a new wardrobe, while I'm left figuring out how to pay for prescription medications on Social Security." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the quiet hum of central air conditioning that I couldn't afford in my modest apartment. Danny and Vanessa stood together in their beautiful living room, surrounded by luxury purchased with my stolen money, asking me to trust them with my financial future. I walked to the door and put my hand on the handle. "You have 48 hours to figure out how to return my money. After that, I'm calling the police." "You wouldn't turn in your own grandson?" Danny said, but his voice carried uncertainty now. I turned back to look at him. Really look at him, and saw a stranger wearing the face of the boy I'd helped raise. "Sarah would be ashamed of what you've become." The drive back to Riverside gave me time to process what I'd learned. Danny was either a willing participant in fraud or a victim of sophisticated manipulation, but either way, my money was gone. Vanessa was clearly the driving force behind whatever scheme had consumed my life savings, and she'd identified Danny as the perfect target. Young, trusting, and with access to an elderly relative's bank account. But they'd made a critical error of judgment. They'd assumed that a 72-year-old grandfather would be too hurt, too confused, or too embarrassed to fight back effectively. They had no idea that 4 decades of construction management had prepared me for exactly this kind of systematic problem-solving. Tomorrow, the real work would begin.
Thursday morning found me at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and my old address book, the leather cover worn smooth from 45 years of professional networking. The yellow legal pad from Tuesday night was now covered with names, phone numbers, and carefully drawn connections between people who might help me understand exactly what Danny and Vanessa had done with my life savings. Sleep had been elusive, but the hours of darkness had given me time to think like a project manager again, breaking down a complex problem into manageable components. The first call went to Miguel Santos, who'd run electrical contracting for 3 decades before retiring to Palm Desert 2 years ago. We'd worked together on dozens of commercial projects, and his voice carried the warmth of someone who'd shared countless early mornings and problem-solving sessions over coffee and construction plans. "Frank Miller, haven't heard from you in months. How's retirement treating you?" "Actually, Miguel, I need some professional advice. You know the Palm Desert area better than anyone. Ever heard of Desert Investment Holdings?"
The pause told me everything before he spoke. "Frank, where did you hear that name?" "My grandson got involved with them somehow, invested a substantial amount of money and won't tell me specifics about the operation." "Jesus, Frank, how much money are we talking about?" $83,000. Miguel's whistle carried clearly through the phone line. "That's serious money." "Frank, I've heard rumors about that outfit for months. Nothing concrete enough to report to authorities, but enough to stay far away from them. They target people with promises of exclusive real estate opportunities, high returns, minimal risk." "What kind of rumors?" "Classic Ponzi setup, from what I can tell. They use money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of success. Meanwhile, the organizers are skimming substantial amounts for their own lifestyle expenses." My pen moved steadily across the legal pad, recording details that painted an increasingly clear picture. Danny hadn't just made a bad investment. He'd been recruited into a criminal enterprise that used his access to my bank account to fund their operations. "Miguel, do you know who runs it?" "Woman named Vanessa Torres, from what I've heard. Mid-20s, very smooth, very convincing. She targets young men with family money or access to elderly relatives, gets them emotionally involved, then uses that relationship to access larger sums." Vanessa Torres. The name confirmed what I'd suspected about her role in manipulating Danny. She hadn't just influenced his decision to steal from me. She'd identified him specifically because of his access to my account and his emotional vulnerability following his mother's death. Has anyone reported this to authorities? That's the problem, Frank. She's careful about staying just within legal boundaries. Everything appears voluntary, all the paperwork looks legitimate, and by the time people realize their money is gone, they're too embarrassed or confused to pursue action. After hanging up with Miguel, I sat back in my chair and considered the implications. Danny wasn't just a victim of bad judgment. He was a recruitment target in a systematic fraud operation. Vanessa had studied him, identified his weaknesses, and exploited his trust for access to my life savings. The expensive condo, the designer clothes, the luxury lifestyle were all purchased with money stolen from elderly victims who trusted their younger relatives. My second call went to Rosa Hernandez, who'd managed permit applications and regulatory compliance for the county building department during most of my construction career. If anyone understood how to research business entities and trace financial connections, it would be someone who'd spent 30 years ensuring contractors followed proper procedures. "Frank, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "Rosa, I need to understand how to research a business entity. Someone calling themselves Desert Investment Holdings has taken a large sum of money from my family, and I want to know exactly what they are and how they operate." Business registration would be filed with the Secretary of State if it's a legitimate company. I can walk you through the online search process, but Frank, if we're talking about substantial money, you might want to consider consulting with law enforcement. I want to understand what I'm dealing with before I involve authorities. Can we meet today? Rosa suggested the public library on University Avenue, where the computers provided free internet access and she could guide me through the research process in person. By 2 o'clock, I was sitting beside her at a terminal, learning how to navigate business databases and public records that would reveal the truth about Vanessa's operation. Desert Investment Holdings showed up in the California Secretary of State database as a limited liability company registered 8 months ago. Vanessa Torres was listed as the managing member, with a business address that matched a mailbox service in Palm Desert.
The registration was legitimate but minimal, providing no details about business activities, financial backing, or investment strategies. Frank, this is what we call a shell company, Rosa explained, pointing to the sparse information on screen. Legally registered, but designed to provide minimal transparency about actual operations. It's not necessarily illegal, but it's suspicious when combined with the other circumstances you've described. We spent the next hour exploring property records, business licenses, and professional registrations. Vanessa Torres appeared in multiple business filings over the past 2 years, always as a managing member or principal, always with different company names but similar vague descriptions of investment services. This is a pattern, Rosa said, printing several pages of records. She creates companies, operates them for several months, then dissolves them and starts new ones. It's a way to stay ahead of complaints and regulatory scrutiny. The pattern painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. Vanessa wasn't just running one investment scam. She was operating multiple overlapping schemes, using new companies to replace old ones when they became too problematic to maintain. Danny's $83,000 was just one transaction in a much larger criminal enterprise. Rosa, how many victims do you think we're looking at? She calculated based on the company registrations and timeline. If each company operated for 6 to 8 months and she needed substantial initial investments to maintain the appearance of returns, probably dozens of victims over the past 2 years, maybe hundreds of thousands in total theft. Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from families, elderly people, young adults who trusted someone they thought cared about them. The scope of Vanessa's operation was far beyond what I'd initially imagined, and Danny was just one of many people she'd manipulated into providing access to money that didn't belong to them. My third call that evening went to James Chen, a retired private investigator who'd worked fraud cases for insurance companies throughout Southern California. We'd met through church social events, and I knew he'd maintained his professional connections even after retiring. Frank, good to hear from you. How can I help? James, I need advice about investigating a suspected investment fraud. Someone has taken $83,000 from my family using what appears to be a sophisticated scam operation. Investment fraud is complex, Frank. Are we talking about a single incident or part of a larger pattern? I summarized what I'd learned from Miguel and Rosa about Vanessa's multiple companies and systematic targeting of vulnerable victims. James listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details. Frank, what you're describing sounds like a classic affinity fraud scheme. The perpetrator builds personal relationships with victims, often romantic or family connections, then uses that trust to access money. It's particularly effective because victims are reluctant to report someone they have emotional attachments to. How do I prove it? Documentation is everything. Bank records, communication trails, evidence of the lifestyle being funded by stolen money, testimony from multiple victims who can establish a pattern of behavior. What about other victims? How do I find them? James paused, considering the question. That's the challenging part. Fraud victims are often embarrassed and isolated. They don't realize others have experienced the same thing. You need to create a way for them to find each other safely. He suggested several approaches: social media groups for fraud victims, community meetings, outreach through local senior centers and financial institutions. The key was building trust with people who'd already been betrayed once and were unlikely to trust easily again. James, can you recommend someone who specializes in financial fraud investigation? There's a woman in Riverside, Patricia Walsh, who left the district attorney's office to handle civil fraud cases. She's excellent at building cases that combine criminal and civil approaches. If you have strong documentation, she might be willing to work on contingency. Patricia Walsh.
The name went into my notebook along with contact information and a reminder to call first thing Friday morning. But first, I needed to gather more evidence and identify other victims who could strengthen the case against Vanessa's operation. Friday morning, I drove to the Desert Hills Country Club, an upscale facility where Miguel had mentioned seeing Vanessa networking with potential victims. The parking lot contained the kind of luxury vehicles that suggested members had substantial disposable income, exactly the demographic she would target for investment fraud. I spent 2 hours in the clubhouse restaurant, observing interactions and listening to conversations. The approach was subtle but systematic. Identify people discussing financial concerns, retirement planning, or family money management, then position herself as someone with exclusive investment opportunities that weren't available through traditional channels. She appeared around 11 o'clock, dressed professionally but approachably, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested business credentials. Her first target was a retired couple discussing concerns about their fixed income keeping up with inflation. Within 15 minutes, she was at their table, presenting herself as a financial consultant who specialized in helping retirees maximize their investment returns. I work with a select group of clients on opportunities that aren't available through conventional investment firms, I overheard her saying. Higher returns, but we have to be discreet about it because of regulatory limitations on how many people we can include. The same pitch she'd probably used on Danny. Exclusive opportunities, higher returns, regulatory limitations that explained why everything had to be kept secret. She was selling access to something special while creating justification for the lack of transparency that legitimate investments would provide. My phone's camera captured several photos of her interactions, documenting her systematic approach to identifying and cultivating potential victims. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Establish financial concerns, present herself as uniquely qualified to help, emphasize exclusivity and time-sensitive opportunities. By noon, I'd observed her exchange contact information with 4 different people, all of them appearing to be wealthy retirees or affluent professionals. 4 more potential victims for an operation that had already consumed my savings and probably dozens of other families' financial security. The drive home gave me time to organize everything I'd learned over the past 3 days. Vanessa Torres operated multiple companies in systematic fraud schemes, targeting vulnerable people through romantic and family relationships. Danny was both a victim of her manipulation and an accomplice in stealing from me. The operation was ongoing, actively recruiting new victims while using stolen money to fund an expensive lifestyle. But most importantly, I'd discovered something Vanessa didn't expect. A victim with the professional experience to investigate her systematically, the determination to see justice delivered, and the knowledge of how to build a case that would withstand scrutiny from law enforcement and civil courts. That evening, I spread all my documentation across the kitchen table like blueprints for a major construction project. Bank records, business registration documents, photographs from the country club, contact information for professionals who could help build a legal case. For the first time since opening that devastating bank statement, I felt like I had the tools necessary to fight back effectively. Patricia Walsh's office would receive my call Monday morning.
But the weekend would be spent organizing evidence and preparing for what would become the most important project management challenge of my retirement. Systematically dismantling the criminal enterprise that had stolen my life savings and was continuing to victimize others. Vanessa had chosen the wrong grandfather to target. She was about to discover that 45 years of managing complex projects had prepared me for exactly this kind of methodical problem-solving. The construction phase of my case was about to begin. Monday morning at 9 sharp, I sat across from Patricia Walsh's desk with 3 manila folders containing the most comprehensive fraud investigation she'd encountered from a civilian. Her office occupied the 2nd floor of a professional building on Market Street, with law books lining the walls and case files organized with the precision I'd once applied to construction project documentation. "Mr. Miller, this documentation is remarkable.
Patricia said, reviewing the business registration records, surveillance photographs, and witness statements I'd compiled over the weekend. I've rarely seen such thorough preparation from someone without formal investigative training. 45 years of project management teaches you to document everything and follow paper trails, I replied. What are our legal options? Patricia spread the documents across her conference table like architectural blueprints. Criminal charges are definitely warranted. Wire fraud, elder abuse, operating an unlicensed investment business. The evidence you've gathered shows clear criminal intent and systematic targeting of vulnerable victims. What about asset recovery? That's where civil litigation becomes crucial. We can freeze bank accounts, pursue asset forfeiture, and seek full restitution plus punitive damages. She pulled out a calculator and began working through numbers. Based on the evidence of lifestyle purchases and ongoing operations, we're looking at potential recovery exceeding $200,000. $200,000, more than double what they'd stolen from me, enough to compensate multiple victims and send a clear message about consequences. The mathematical precision satisfied the part of my mind that had spent decades balancing construction budgets and ensuring projects came in on target. How quickly can we move? Criminal referral to the district attorney this afternoon, civil asset freezing by tomorrow morning. But Mr. Miller, the most powerful approach would be coordinating with other victims to demonstrate the full scope of this operation. Patricia was right about victim coordination, but finding people who'd been defrauded by Vanessa would require a different approach than my usual construction industry networking. Fraud victims were often embarrassed, isolated, and reluctant to admit they'd been deceived. I needed to create opportunities for them to identify themselves safely. That afternoon, I visited the Riverside Senior Center, where the community bulletin board offered a perfect venue for discreet outreach. The notice I posted was carefully worded to avoid legal complications while clearly communicating its purpose. Seeking information about Desert Investment Holdings and related companies. If you or someone you know has had financial dealings with this organization, please contact Frank Miller for confidential discussion. Similar notices went up at 3 other senior centers throughout Riverside County, the public library, and several church community boards. Within 48 hours, my phone began ringing with calls from people who recognized the company name and had stories that mirrored my own experience. Martha Rodriguez called first. Her voice carried the same mixture of anger and embarrassment I'd felt when I first discovered my empty bank account. Mr. Miller, I saw your notice at St. Catherine's. My nephew got involved with that company 6 months ago and convinced me to invest my late husband's life insurance money. $25,000. Gone. How did your nephew get connected with them?
Through his girlfriend, pretty young woman who seemed very knowledgeable about investments. She convinced him this was a chance to help his family while making money for himself. The same pattern Vanessa had used with Danny. Identify young men with access to family money, establish romantic relationships, then manipulate those relationships to access larger sums from elderly relatives. Martha's nephew had been as much a recruitment target as Danny, selected specifically for his family connections and emotional vulnerability. Martha, would you be willing to meet with other people who've had similar experiences? You mean there are others? By Thursday evening, 7 victims had contacted me, representing over $150,000 in stolen money. Each story followed the same basic pattern. Young relative meets attractive woman with exclusive investment opportunities. Older family member pressured or deceived into providing substantial funds. Money disappears into vague business ventures while lifestyle expenses increase dramatically. The community center meeting room felt like a construction project kickoff meeting as I organized the whiteboard with timelines, dollar amounts, and connection patterns. 7 victims, ages ranging from 42 to 81, each representing a different facet of Vanessa's systematic targeting strategy.
What we're seeing here isn't random financial crime, I explained, pointing to the organized timeline. This is a calculated criminal enterprise targeting specific demographics and using sophisticated manipulation techniques. Robert Ken, whose son had been recruited through social media connections, studied the documentation with the careful attention of someone who'd spent his career in accounting. The timeline shows she never operates more than 2 companies simultaneously, but she overlaps their operations to maintain continuous cash flow. Exactly. She uses money from new victims to pay modest returns to earlier victims, creating the appearance of legitimate profits while skimming substantial amounts for personal expenses. Patricia Walsh had agreed to attend the meeting as legal counsel for our coalition. Her presence gave credibility to our group and ensured everything we discussed would be protected by attorney-client privilege. With this level of victim coordination and evidence documentation, we can pursue both criminal prosecution and civil asset recovery, Patricia explained. The district attorney's office has already expressed strong interest in this case based on Mr. Miller's initial evidence. But criminal prosecution was only part of the strategy I'd developed. Vanessa's operation depended on maintaining a respectable public image that allowed her to network at places like Desert Hills Country Club and recruit new victims through social connections. Destroying that image would be as effective as freezing her bank accounts. Friday morning found me at the offices of the Desert Sun newspaper, Riverside County's primary publication, with a carefully prepared press release about our victim coalition and the scope of Vanessa's fraud operation. The business reporter, Linda Stevens, had covered white-collar crime for 15 years and immediately recognized the significance of what we documented. "Mr. Miller, this is exactly the kind of systematic fraud that needs public attention," Linda said, reviewing our evidence files. "Would your coalition be willing to go on record with their experiences? We want to prevent other families from being victimized. If publicity helps accomplish that, we're prepared to speak publicly." The article would run Sunday in the business section, but Linda also suggested a follow-up television interview with the local ABC affiliate for their consumer protection segment. Public exposure would make it nearly impossible for Vanessa to continue operating in Riverside County. That afternoon, I drove to the Desert Hills Country Club with a different purpose than my previous surveillance visit. This time, I carried copies of our court filings, criminal complaints, and newspaper article proofs to share with the club's management.
Private clubs depended on their reputation for discretion and exclusivity, and they wouldn't tolerate criminal activity on their premises. "Mr. Thompson, I need to bring something to your attention," I said, sitting across from the club manager in his tastefully appointed office. "One of your regular guests has been using club facilities to recruit victims for investment fraud." I placed the documentation on his desk, watching his expression change as he realized the implications for the club's reputation and potential legal liability. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention, Mr. Miller. Desert Hills has a zero-tolerance policy for any illegal activity on club property." He picked up his phone immediately. "I'm calling security to revoke her guest privileges and ensure she's removed from the premises if she attempts to return." By evening, Vanessa's world was beginning to collapse with the same systematic precision she'd used to target her victims. Criminal charges filed with multiple agencies, civil asset freezing orders signed by the court, newspaper articles scheduled for publication, country club access revoked, and bank accounts under investigation by financial crimes units. Saturday brought the most satisfying phone call of the entire process. Danny's voice carried a panic I'd never heard before, the confident young man who'd dismissed my concerns, now facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. "Grandpa Frank, the police came to the condo this morning with search warrants. They seized Vanessa's computer, her files, even some of her jewelry. She's been arrested." "I'm not surprised. Financial fraud is a serious crime, Danny." "But I didn't know it was fraud. She told me these were legitimate investments. I thought I was helping you and the family by getting involved in something profitable."
The same excuse he'd used when I confronted him initially, but his voice now carried genuine fear rather than casual dismissal. The reality of criminal consequences had finally penetrated his willful ignorance about where the money was actually going. Danny, ignorance doesn't absolve you of responsibility for stealing $83,000 from your grandfather's bank account. The investigators want to interview me as a witness. They say I might face charges too if I don't cooperate completely. Then you should cooperate completely and tell them everything you know about Vanessa's operation. Grandpa, I need your help. Can you call your lawyer and ask her to represent me? I can't afford legal fees with all my accounts frozen. The irony was perfect. Danny wanted me to pay for his legal defense after he'd stolen my life savings to fund the criminal enterprise that had gotten him into legal trouble. He still didn't understand that consequences meant taking responsibility for your choices rather than expecting someone else to rescue you. You'll need to handle your own legal problems, Danny. I'm focused on helping the other victims recover their money. The silence stretched long enough to communicate exactly how completely his world had changed. No more expensive condo, no more designer clothes, no more girlfriend to manipulate him into making profitable decisions. Just the reality of criminal charges, financial ruin, and the social stigma that comes with being associated with systematic fraud. Sunday's newspaper article exceeded my expectations for comprehensive coverage. Linda Stevens had interviewed 4 coalition members, included photographs of the seized assets, and provided detailed explanation of how Vanessa's operation had targeted vulnerable families throughout Southern California. The headline read, "Local Coalition Exposes Multi-Million-Dollar Investment Fraud Ring." Multi-million dollars. The investigation had uncovered far more victims and stolen money than our initial coalition had represented. Vanessa's operation had been active for over 3 years, with dozens of victims across multiple counties and total theft approaching $2 million. Monday morning brought a call from Detective Maria Santos with the Riverside County Financial Crimes Unit. Her voice carried professional respect for the quality of evidence I'd compiled and the coordination I'd achieved among the victim coalition. "Mr. Miller, your documentation has been crucial to this investigation. We've identified 23 additional victims and traced asset purchases totaling over $400,000. The district attorney wants to meet with you about testifying in the criminal trial." $400,000 in traceable assets, enough to provide significant restitution to all victims even before pursuing wage garnishment and additional recovery methods. The systematic approach had achieved exactly the results I'd calculated when I first decided to fight back professionally rather than emotionally. "Detective Santos, what's the timeline for prosecution?" "Criminal trial is scheduled for next month. With the evidence you've provided and the victim testimony we've collected, this should be a straightforward conviction on multiple felony counts." That evening, I sat in my modest apartment reading follow-up coverage in 3 different newspapers about the case that had become a model for how fraud victims could effectively organize and seek justice. The phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters, other potential victims, and law enforcement agencies dealing with similar fraud operations. Patricia Walsh called with an update on asset recovery proceedings. "Frank, the civil court has ordered liquidation of all seized assets, with proceeds distributed proportionally to documented victims. Based on current valuations, you should recover approximately 60% of your stolen money within 90 days. 60% recovery was better than most fraud victims ever achieved. But more importantly, the systematic investigation had prevented dozens of additional families from being victimized and had established legal precedents for prosecuting similar schemes. The construction project was nearly complete. Vanessa's criminal enterprise had been systematically dismantled, her assets seized and distributed to victims, her ability to continue operations permanently destroyed.
Danny would face the legal consequences of his choices without my assistance or protection. Justice had been achieved through professional methodology rather than emotional reaction. Tomorrow would bring the final phase, watching the court proceedings deliver the institutional validation that crimes like this carry serious, permanent consequences. Wednesday morning, October 15th, I stood on the courthouse steps wearing my best suit and carrying the briefcase that had accompanied me through decades of construction meetings and now 2 months of legal proceedings. Patricia Walsh waited beside me, her confidence radiating the same professional competence I'd once brought to major building projects. The Riverside County Courthouse buzzed with activity as our coalition of victims assembled in the gallery. Martha Rodriguez, Robert Chen, and 5 others whose lives Vanessa had disrupted with systematic theft nodded respectfully as I passed. Their presence validated the methodical approach I'd used to transform individual victimization into collective justice. Vanessa sat at the defendant's table in county jail clothing, her expensive wardrobe replaced by orange fabric that announced her changed circumstances to everyone in the courtroom. The confident woman who'd manipulated Danny and targeted vulnerable families now appeared diminished, isolated, and facing consequences she'd never anticipated when she started her criminal enterprise. Judge Harrison entered with the gravity befitting a criminal case that had drawn media attention throughout Southern California. The evidence I'd compiled, the coalition I'd organized, and the systematic prosecution we'd built had become a reference point for how fraud victims could effectively seek justice through proper legal channels. Ms. Torres, you have been found guilty of wire fraud, elder abuse, and operating an unlicensed investment business.
The evidence shows you systematically targeted vulnerable victims and stole over $1.8 million through false promises and manipulation. $1.8 million. The investigation had uncovered even more victims and stolen money than our coalition had originally represented. Vanessa's operation had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized, with victims across 3 counties and fraud dating back nearly 4 years. The court sentences you to 5 years in state prison, followed by 3 years supervised probation, and orders full restitution to all identified victims. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of institutional authority. All assets will be liquidated, and your future earnings will be garnished until complete repayment is achieved. 5 years in prison, complete asset forfeiture, permanent criminal record, and financial ruin extending decades into the future. The systematic pressure campaign had achieved results that exceeded even my most optimistic calculations when I first decided to fight back professionally. Danny sat in the back row of the courtroom gallery, having testified for the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. His cooperation had provided crucial evidence about Vanessa's recruitment methods and manipulation techniques, but it hadn't restored our relationship or earned him forgiveness for stealing my life savings. After the hearing, he approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Grandpa Frank, I know what I did was wrong. I've learned from this experience, and I want to make things right between us." "Danny, some things can't be repaired with apologies. You chose to steal from your family, and that choice has permanent consequences." "But I testified against her. I helped the prosecution build their case. That has to count for something." His expectation that cooperation with law enforcement would restore family relationships showed he still didn't understand the fundamental issue. Helping to convict the person who manipulated you doesn't undo the betrayal of stealing from the grandfather who raised you. You testified to save yourself from more serious charges, not to help your victims. Those are very different motivations. Danny's face cycled through emotions I recognized from his childhood. Confusion when his manipulation didn't work, anger when he couldn't get what he wanted,
And finally, resignation when he realized the situation was beyond his control. So that's it? We're never going to be family again? Family requires trust, loyalty, and respect. You destroyed all three when you forged my signature and stole my money. Those bonds can't be rebuilt with words. Patricia Walsh joined us as Danny walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Frank, the asset liquidation has been completed. Your recovery check should arrive within 2 weeks. How much? $73,000 plus interest. Not complete restitution, but better recovery than most fraud victims achieve. $73,000 out of my original $83,000, nearly 90% recovery through systematic legal action. The remaining $10,000 would be recovered through wage garnishment over the next several years, ensuring complete financial restitution eventually. Outside the courthouse, local news reporters gathered around our victim coalition for the final interviews about a case that had demonstrated how organized, methodical action could triumph over sophisticated financial crime. Mr. Miller, what advice would you give to other fraud victims? Asked the Channel 7 correspondent. Document everything, find other victims, work with experienced legal counsel, and never give up. The system works when you use it correctly and persistently. Do you think this case will deter similar fraud operations? I hope it sends a clear message that targeting vulnerable families carries serious consequences. Crime doesn't pay, but justice does when you pursue it professionally.
The drive home took me through neighborhoods where I'd worked construction projects for decades, past familiar landmarks that represented honest work and fair compensation for skilled labor. The contrast with Vanessa's criminal shortcuts and lifestyle built on stolen money couldn't have been starker. That evening, I sat in my modest apartment reading congratulatory messages from fraud victims across the country who'd heard about our case through news coverage. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions had requested our documentation to help build cases against similar investment scams, turning our experience into a template for systematic fraud prosecution. My phone rang with a call from Detective Santos, who'd become a professional colleague during the investigation process. Frank, I wanted you to know that 3 other fraud operations in Southern California have shut down since news of the Torres conviction spread. Your case has had impacts beyond just your direct victims. 3 other criminal enterprises deterred by the demonstration that fraud victims could organize effectively and achieve meaningful justice? The ripple effects of systematic action extended far beyond my personal recovery, protecting families I would never meet from crimes that would never be committed. Patricia Walsh called with final updates on the civil proceedings. Frank, the restitution payments have been distributed to all coalition members. Total recovery exceeded $400,000, with additional payments continuing through wage garnishment programs. $400,000 recovered and returned to families who'd been victimized by someone they trusted? The mathematical precision satisfied something deep in my professional soul, proof that methodical approaches could solve even the most emotionally devastating problems. My kitchen table was clear that night for the first time in 2 months. No legal documents, no evidence files, no victim contact lists. Just the evening newspaper with a follow-up article about how the Torres case had become a model for fraud victim advocacy and prosecution coordination. The construction project was complete. Vanessa's criminal enterprise had been systematically dismantled, her ability to harm others permanently eliminated, and meaningful consequences delivered through proper legal channels. Danny faced ongoing financial and legal consequences for his choices, but he was alive and free to rebuild his life through honest work rather than theft. Most importantly, the case had demonstrated that age, modest means, and individual victimization didn't prevent effective response to financial crime. Professional methodology, systematic evidence collection, and coordinated action could achieve justice even when conventional approaches failed. The phone stopped ringing as media interest moved on to newer stories. The mailbags no longer filled with victim testimonies and legal correspondence. My modest apartment returned to the quiet routine of retirement, but with restored financial security and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served completely and permanently.
At 72 years old, I'd learned that construction skills translated perfectly to legal construction. Foundation work through evidence gathering, framework through coalition building, and finishing work through systematic prosecution. The most important project of my retirement had been completed on schedule and within budget. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired. But justice, when pursued systematically and professionally, could always be achieved. The system had worked exactly as designed, delivering consequences that matched the crimes and protection for future potential victims. Some structures needed to be torn down completely before better ones could be built in their place. Vanessa's criminal empire was gone, Danny's comfortable lives were shattered, and a financial security I'd worked 45 years to build was substantially restored. The construction was complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.